Welcome to the Happy Fools podcast. I'm your co-host Trevor, broadcasting from the floor of my parents' guest room in Oregon. Not joined by Alfredo, instead joined by Peter, aka Cheese, from the Brothers of the Serpent Discord.
I'm just gonna. How's that for an entrance?
That might be the best guest entrance ever. We started off with the sneeze off. How you feeling? How
I
you
was
doing?
going to drown for a minute, but I'm all right.
That's a classic Happy Fools intro. Awesome. Well, welcome to the show, man. So we were just chatting a little bit before you got here. Alfredo couldn't make it. It's midday for us, so he's
Of course, yeah.
he's doing stuff, and I'm running late because I was talking to my boss. And
Oh
so
man,
thank you for waiting up for us. Appreciate
that's
it.
all right. You should try and be your own boss one day. It's a good thing.
Is that your move? Is that what you do?
Yeah, I'm a gardener, so I look after myself. I'm a great boss to myself, possibly to the detriment of the business, but
That's fantastic.
but we all get along in the business.
Yes, that's the job out here, to own a landscaping company. That's when you've arrived. Yeah. But I can't complain. My boss is a nice guy. We were talking about, we normally never have side conversations, but all of a sudden he wanted to talk about prion disease and all sorts of stuff. Anyway, it's a very long story, but anyway,
Midday on a Wednesday, you know.
he must be going through some stuff. But anyway, so Peter is here again. Cheese from the Brothers of the Serpent Discord server. Can I ask where your username comes from?
It's just from my surname. My surname is Chesborough, which is quite unusual in Britain. I think there's more Chesboroughs or Cheesebrows or Chesboroughs and things like that in the States than there are in the UK. There's hardly any of us here. But I've just been called Cheese since I was a youngster, and it kind of stuck. So
That's so fun.
it's like a dedication to my Celtic heritage, where we love the dairy, like.
Fantastic. Yes, it's when I saw your last name, I was like, "Wow, what a British last name!" And here I find out it's not.
There's somewhere in in one of the Carolinas, I think there's a town or like a non-urban community or something called Chesborough or something like that, which is weird.
Non-urban community. I like that. Let's just start off with a hard-hitting question. Are you ready?
Oh yeah,
Jeremy Clarkson,
right.
the best or the absolute best?
At
Oh no, you don't like it? Do people
no,
not?
no, no, it's fine. It's one of those things where, I mean, he's been on TV since I was a child.
Yeah,
As
yeah.
as like a thing. It's like
Right.
I don't even think of him as something that can be. It's sort of like just like a bizarre institution that's just there, no matter how you feel about it. Do you know what I mean?
Right, right. He's been on TV for 40 years. Yeah, that makes sense.
yeah.
I love that show, Clarkson Farm. It cracks me
Oh
up.
yeah, no, it is a good laugh. It certainly is. And I'm from a rural place, so there's a lot that rings true about it sometimes as well. So
And that marks the end of my British pop culture knowledge. We'll move on. We'll move on. So
that's
today,
about all we've got, to be honest.
okay. The Spice Girls and Jeremy Clarkson.
Jeremy Clarkson, yeah.
So anyone who doesn't know who that is, you should go watch Clarkson Farm on Amazon. It's great. But anyway, so we're talking about, I think, a really cool topic, although I'm going to admit I don't know anything about it. We're talking about King Arthur.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so my, again, incredibly surface level knowledge would be that this is this mythological figure based on some legend, but it may be more than that.
Okay, well,
Is that true?
it's interesting. So when you think about mythological ages, Greece, and the Middle East, Egypt, you're going back into the Bronze Age, if not before. That's the time of myths and heroes and Hercules and Achilles, and
Yes.
this is a time, it's beyond our reach almost historically. and that's kind of why it's become so shrouded in mystery. Um, but like Arthur's a character from the 6th century AD, so why has it become this sort of weird, diaphanous, sort of mythological thing? It sticks out weirdly chronologically, you
Because
know?
it's so much more recent, you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's something weird going on straight away that we can pick up on.
Yeah, there
Um,
aren't that many mythological figures from, you know, 1400 years ago. Like I don't know how many others there are. I'm sure there are some.
yeah, I suppose it could be different, like nation to nation, depending on where their history it sits. I mean, when you're looking at like the Mesoamerican cultures, we often equate them with the ancient Middle East and stuff, but a lot of the, mainstream dating only puts them, either 500,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago. I know a lot of them do go back further, but, if you think about the Inca or the Aztecs or something, these are sort of fairly recent civilizations. So maybe it's to do with different country to country. But when you look at Arthur, it's really interesting because kind of your opinion of is sort of what we could say is kind of like the mainstream consensus today.
Sure.
That there was some sort of ancient idea of this great kingly figure, which has then sort of been transposed into a historical period, and mythology has become historicized, basically.
Could you could you just for folks who just don't know anything about this topic, could you give us the mainstream view to the best of your
Yeah,
knowledge?
sure. So, um, where do we start? I mean, it's hard because what we want to like. One thing I'd like to do and look at is sort of like where are the texts? Where does Arthur come from? What sort of texts does he come from? What sort of archaeology does he come from?
Right.
And the text. So Britain's really interesting because when it comes to ancient manuscripts, especially those of us in what we call England today, we get sort of taught we don't have an ancient culture. That we don't really know anything before the Romans turned up, which is about 45 AD, something like that.
Interesting.
And then we have some records from the Roman period between 45 AD and 400 AD. Then it seems to go quiet again, and we don't have anything. And then around about 900 AD, things start picking up again, and then we've got a much more detailed history. The big omission is that we actually have thousands and thousands of manuscripts, and I mean thousands, so many, which pertain to those periods where we don't have manuscripts from. So we have loads of data about the pre-Roman period. We have loads of what am I looking for? Native stories about the Roman period, not from the Roman perspective necessarily,
Right.
and from that period after. But because a lot of these are late records, they're almost completely, by today's academia, completely ignored. And so this idea of a just quickly, this idea of a mythologized Arthur is really only the mainstream idea today. That we have there was some sort of idea of him that became transposed into a certain period. But if you only go back 50 or 100 years, you'll get a very different mainstream opinion on what Arthur was. And after the Second World War, it was very much mainstream opinion that Arthur was a historical king of all the Britons in the 6th century AD. And now today, he's become a diaphanous mythological figure. But it's only to do with something that, you come across a lot with this history. It's all to do with paradigms in academia. What comes in and out of, in and out of style. And in particular with this topic is what politics comes in and out of fashion. And this is because essentially in Britain, we're looking at the history of, to boil it down, two nations, one in the East, one in the West. And this is all to do with the Saxons. So I got some images and stuff, so we can have a look at some maps and things like that as well, if you want to. But if you want to have any questions or anything before we do anything like that?
I think any question I have might take us into two.
Yeah.
I mean, because I have a million questions. I have questions about like what was the explain a little bit more what the previous mainstream conception was compared to today, and then also the
Okay.
two kingdoms that you're talking, or these two Saxons, and what's the other?
The Britons.
The Britons. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So this
My
is.
only knowledge of this comes from the Netflix series with Uhtred, son of Uhtred. Do you know what I'm talking about? What's
there's
that
been a
called?
few of those historical ones around that period recently, isn't there?
So
Yeah.
I'll stop embarrassing myself. Please tell us more.
There was an Arthur one called The Winter King. I think it was based on
I haven't seen
a
that.
Bernard Cornwell recently. I'm not sure if that was Netflix or not, but a lot of people have been talking about that recently.
You know, it's funny. Just
Um,
before you answer my question, it is
yeah,
amazing how much attention this particular story has gotten from Hollywood.
yeah,
It's wild how many movies there are about this topic. So
yeah, yeah.
anyway, please continue.
So it comes back really. Let's have a look. Let's see if we can find a book. Uh, it'll probably be a backwards book if I hold it up to the camera. There we go. A backwards book. The History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth. So this was written in about 1150 AD. So it's 500 years after the life of Arthur. So this is a late text, really, in what you want to look for ideally.
Right.
But it's the first real narrative story about Arthur. So there are plenty of mentions of Arthur before this book, but they are normally just they're little bits here and there, mentions in poetry. We've got a lot of like ecclesiastical records about certain saints, and sometimes the Arthur will appear in the life of the saint, sometimes as a relative of the saint, and we might have a look at a couple of those people later on as well. And this book caused a real stir in as much as it was probably the most popular book in Europe at the time.
Wow.
It was massive. It's what caused the huge wave of European romances that followed. All the big ones that came afterwards, The Green Knight, anything by Chrétien de Troyes, yeah, all the guys that Randall Carlson talks about when he talks about the romances. The Geoffrey really spawned that. But he was writing, and it's really interesting to talk about those things because all of those books, they're basically, how's the way to put? They're like fanfic for medieval Britain.
Okay.
All the places, all the characters and stuff are all these really random 6th century Western British monarchs, saints, figures in history. And they're all just like transposed and moved into these various settings and romantic stories and things like that. But it's really odd. So you can find these people in like ancient manuscripts dealing with genealogies of the Welsh kings, and then suddenly you can find them in Brittany riding around, looking for the Holy Grail or something like that. Sure. 600 years later. But yeah, Geoffrey is.
I just want to make sure I understand that point. So the point you're making is when you call it fan fiction, it's just this idea that they're using real names of real people, but they're kind of in the wrong spot, doing the wrong thing. It seems.
Not entirely. I mean, it really does bear weight for the rest of the politics of northwestern Europe at the time.
Okay.
So Britain would have been one of the major powers of the period at the time. You also had like the Frankish nation, which is the beginning of France as we know it. The various Germanic tribes. Of course, Rome is still a big power player at the time, but not quite as, not quite the big boy they once were in the West. But so all of these nations still have a connection to Britain at this time. It would have been an important thing, and certainly there is no reason that heroes from Britain, they would have been bloodthirsty aristocrats, I'm sure, but heroes for Britain weren't campaigning in Northern Europe and being involved in the politics and the religion as well at the time.
Okay.
it's just really curious how it becomes like their most favorite thing, and it could be a lot to do with the fact that they've lost a lot of their history at the time. They lost a lot of their history, from the incoming Germanic invaders. There's a lot of chaos in
Right.
in Eastern Europe, German area around the time. So, um, yeah, this book, Geoffrey of Monmouth, it really did. It was hugely popular. They've got still like 30 to 50 original like really old manuscript versions. Normally, you only have a few copies of things. You
It was
don't often
popular.
have it. They've just got loads of them because it was just copied and just like all over the place. But
Okay, so
it's
it was incredibly popular. Does he give a sense of where he's drawing this information?
absolutely,
Okay.
yes. In fact, he tells us everything we need to know in the introduction.
And some of
Um,
it, I assume, is are older sources, right? So it's kind of
absolutely,
secondary,
absolutely.
even though it's a late source, it's based on earlier sources. Okay.
Yes, yes. So the problem with Jeffrey is he becomes the most maligned book as well in
Uh,
British academia.
okay.
So basically, can I just get up some maps? Am I able
Yeah,
to
yeah.
share?
You should be able to. Let me know if
Cool.
not. This is
Let's have a
exciting.
look.
It's always so nice to have a geography and a tongue.
Yeah, absolutely. It helps you. Um, Let's see if I've got.
Okay, I can see that.
That's cool. Let's see if I think I've got the beginnings of like presentation. Started ages ago. Snake Rose Press. um, so let's have a look. So
Oh, this is awesome. I'm excited.
okay. So see if I can move my face out of the way as well, just for my own pleasure. Um, to start with, I'm going to say there's a big thing missing from this map, and it's not Scotland. No, not being rude. The important thing missing is a little part of northwestern France called Brittany. Now, guess where Brittany got its name from? I'll give
You know, it's
you.
funny. I've never even put that together, but of course, the Britons, right? The Britons.
It's Little Britain. That's literally what it means. You have Great Britain above and Little Britain below.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
so right at the end of the fourth century, the Romans had like a series. I mean, when people are like, "Oh, the Roman Empire was so organized and so wonderful, and everyone just did what they were told," blah blah. It's nonsense. Especially in like the third and fourth century, it was a freaking bloodbath. Like there were people going backwards and forwards and slaughtering each other and usurpers and people taking over, and it was an absolute mess. Especially in the West, and one of the big ones was a chap called Magnus Maximus, and he raised huge armies from the legions of Britain, and he took them into France and then conquered the Western Empire, basically. And he gave the warriors from Britain he gave them Brittany in northern France, and this meant that by the sixth century, Brittany was basically speaking the same language as Britain. It had shared religion, shared kings, and even to today, Brittany is still a Celtic language speaking area. So although they do mainly speak French, Breton is actually the sort of local regional language. Um,
If I was a
so
politician in England, I think I would advocate for you guys to restore your imperialism and go take Brittany back.
I think the thing is, right, this is right. We're going to get into all sorts of stuff here, right? Okay. So the important thing to talk about is I mean, this one, we've got a sort of full map of Britain here.
Yeah.
A modern map of Britain, you'd have a line up here, and this bulge on the west here, this is Wales, right? And
Okay.
then you've got a line across the top, and this would be Scotland. Let's say Brittany's below. And then all this area is England. Now, of course, this wasn't the case really until about 900 AD. When we're going back to the period we're talking about, England didn't exist at all. And in fact, the idea of England was almost non existent. The
I'm really
Britons.
sorry. I'm really sorry to do this because this might be like super common
No,
knowledge.
no, no, go for
It
it.
might
Go for it. I'd rather be clear than.
it might just reveal my absolute ignorance, which is embarrassing. But could you just explain to us, ignorant folks across the pond,
No,
the
no, no.
difference between, obviously, I understand the United Kingdom, but the difference between English, British,
Yeah.
um,
Okay. So this is
Saxon.
sort of where I'm going with this, but I
Okay.
do have to go around the long way a bit.
Okay.
So when the Romans left, you can, sorry, even when the Romans arrived, let's say when the Romans arrived, you basically had from the south of the island to the north, a group of people who all spoke at least versions of the same language.
Okay.
Okay. And generally today we call these the Brythonic people,
Okay.
right? So generally, you'll see people just say Celts, right?
Sure.
But the problem with Celts, there's lots of people who have lots of different issues with the word Celt. But so Tolkien, this is a really good Tolkien quote. Tolkien said, "Celtic is a magic bag into which you can put anything and take anything out."
Got it.
Right? Right. So you see where he's going with it? People will
Sure.
just go, "Oh yeah, that's Celtic," or "No, I don't like that being Celtic. I'm not going to call it Celtic." And we are talking about a massive. You get Celts all the way over in Turkey and all over in the west of Europe. If you want to narrow it down, on the main island of Britain, you've got the Irish, and then we had the Brythonic people.
And when, sorry, you already said this, but when would this have been that the Romans arrived?
So the Roman invasion was the successful Roman invasion was about 50 AD, 55 AD.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So about
So
two.
I always get actually there's two confused. So Julius Caesar came in the first century BC, and I always get that one of them's 43 AD, and Caesar came in 55 BC. Sorry, Caesar Julius Caesar, right? He was so successful in his first invasion, he had to come back the next year and do it again. And he
Got it.
was so successful. He was so successful in his second invasion that not another Roman soldier set foot in Britain for another 90 years.
All right.
Right? But that's where his propaganda goes, basically. And so, but then what we have on the right here, so we got the Romans arrived. They met this sort of homogenous language. They say they were individual tribal kingdoms and etc. But the Romans mainly. This is probably an old map, but generally the concentration is in the southeast of England, right? This is the concentration of like Roman buildings, Roman archaeology, Roman towns, legionary fortresses, etc. And you can see that the Western Highlands are kind of and the north are much less, a lot less density of Roman affected areas. Now, when the Romans left in 410 AD, or when they were asked to leave, I think is probably more accurate. This is the area that immediately fell victim to piracy.
Okay.
Constantly throughout the Roman period, people coming over from Denmark, from sort of modern Holland, that sort of area, and doing lots of piracy on the east coast of Britain. And these are the Saxon pirates that eventually became the people who founded the Saxon. They were Jutish. Sorry, I'm getting confused here. Saxons, Jutish, and Danes as well. And they founded lots of kingdoms, and that basically all their kingdoms essentially became modern England, right?
Okay.
The Britons were the people of the West, sort of in this period, then became the people of the Western Highlands. So these maps are a bit confusing because they're kind of trying to demonstrate something else. But the Saxons essentially pushed from east to west. There's lots of disagreement about how that happened, whether it was peaceful, whether it was warlike, whether it was continual bloodthirsty war, or whether it was, periods of peace interspersed with war. So much disagreement in this period about what happened. But it's the Saxons who formed the country that we call modern day England.
Okay.
And the Britons were then sort of, I don't say relegated, but they sort of formed to the modern day Celtic nations of Wales. Um, Scotland is a Pictish and Brythonic kingdoms sort of combined, but there's lots of other history involved. And then in the West Country here as well, just this bottom end here, Cornwall, although it's now a modern English county, has a really strong independent identity and culture, which is very similar. They have a very similar language to the Welsh and to those Bretons in northwestern France. So someone in Wales could speak to someone in Cornwall and to someone in Brittany, and they could probably all just about get along and talk to each other.
This is how we understand all of Jeremy Clarkson's jokes.
Yeah, about Welsh people speaking funny and things like
not
that.
being able to understand people from Cornwall. I'm like, oh, okay. So not to get too into the weeds here, but so these are really just geographical distinctions. I mean, these are not necessarily based on religious differences or ethnic differences, genetic. This started really as just based on geography.
So, well, that's the thing is that it's when it comes to like the genetics is such a mess, and this is why there's so much disagreement about the Saxon invasion or whatever you want to call it, is because the genetic evidence isn't clear.
Okay.
The historical evidence isn't clear. The archaeological evidence isn't clear. And I think the problem is people try to put certain ideologies on it. So a lot of people in the past kind of liked the idea of some sort of Saxon genocide right across the country.
Okay.
Now that doesn't seem to bear up to the facts. And I think that the difference is we think about movements of people, but it will probably be the influx of a ruling class, essentially. The makeup of the general populace is not going to change much.
Right.
But, styles, culture, all the nice finds you find are going to start looking different. People are going to start calling themselves different names and things because they're going to go along with what the leaders are doing, essentially.
Right.
The confusing part is that this word Britain is really associated with these Western peoples, the Cornish, the Welsh. But you've heard of a guy called John Dee, right?
Called what?
John Dee.
John
You
Dee.
might have heard him on Marty's UFO sods.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So John Dee is basically, he invented this. It's basically an incredible piece of Orwellian control, essentially, where he was chief advisor to the Tudors in the 16th century. And the Tudors very much played up on their Welshness in order to solidify their power.
Okay.
But they weren't very Welsh. they had links there, but they weren't.
Were they German by chance?
They basically did a dirty on it. So they wanted to combine England and Wales, and they did this by trying to make Wales more English. They changed all the courts had to be in English. All the documentation suddenly had to be in English. There was an Act of Union, or just written out. Wales is a real early victim of what we can call the British Empire. And John Dee coined this phrase, the British Empire. He didn't call it the English Empire. He called it the British Empire. But really, the seat of power of the empire was England.
Interesting. Wow.
And John Dee himself was Welsh as well. He's from North Wales.
Yeah, this is fascinating because, I mean, from my perspective, I feel like I hear people use the word England and Britain interchangeably today.
Yeah.
Is that true? Even there?
Yeah, I mean, I think originally, I think probably the earliest use was probably used just to describe the archipelago as the British Isles. The whole archipelago. Which is thousands of islands, really.
Right.
And it's meant to link back to the Latin for being painted. So they use woad, which is like a blue plant-made paint to paint skin and stuff like that.
Right.
And it's meant to become from a word like that. But it also possibly has another link to a name because Britain has a founding story. Did you know that?
No,
No, no
I
one
don't know.
knows. No one knows that Britain has a founding story,
I don't
and
know anything.
this this is when you start to get all like your conspiracy guy jumps up inside you
I love
because
it.
like I was born and brought up in this bit here that says Dum Non Nai, right? I was born and brought up here, and this is like
Sorry,
classic.
where's your cursor at?
Oh, sorry, right. Oh God, that's Ross.
Hey, Ross.
Back we go. Um, Here it says Dum Non Nai here,
Okay,
right in
got
the
it.
center of the screen. Yeah.
Yep.
So I'm from this area here, and this is classic like Celtic lands in a general sense, right? And I had no idea that Britain had a founding story. I had no idea that there were there were a whole group of people even called the Britons in a sense. When I was in school, the Britons would be the people on the other side of the map.
Gotcha.
So
Yeah.
you'd be taught about the Romans, right? And the Britons would be on the other side of the map.
Right.
Then we'd be taught about the Saxons, and the Britons would be on the other side of the map. And that's basically as far as it went. We weren't told that they had a founding story and thousands of years of history, and it's just crazy.
Well, give
So
us a
that
taste. Give us a little bit of it.
well, it's so like for instance, I was talking about Magnus Maximus, that Roman emperor. Yeah, there's a Welsh sports song. I think it's a rugby song. It's a recent song, but like one of the first lines is "You don't remember Maxent, do you?" And it's
Oh,
basically the Welsh saying you don't remember Magnus Maximus. We did. We've got history about him. You don't know who he is. Like this is our ancient time. So Britain was one story is that it gets its name from Brutus, who was a descendant of Aeneas of Troy.
okay.
And the Trojans, after fleeing Troy, obviously Aeneas went on to found Rome, according to Virgil and many others, is that they were kind of split up all across the Mediterranean. Some were in Greece, some were in Italy, blah, 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 blah. And Brutus got into a bit of a trouble when he accidentally murdered his father. And he basically decided to get a load of these Trojan refugees together and take them to the Honey Island in the west, which was Britain.
Yeah.
And when they got here, they had to fight a few giants. And once they'd done that, they founded a Trojan dynasty, which lasted 1,000 years. So it's
Wow.
pretty interesting.
That's fascinating. Well,
So some people, you get some people who'll say Geoffrey invented Brutus, but he didn't. It's in another book, which is 100 years older, called
okay.
History Britonum by a chap called I say by Nennius. Nennius is a name that's associated with that text anyway.
It's interesting because you're presenting this, and to me it's just fascinating history. But I get a sense from the way you're phrasing things that this is sort of well, I guess I'll just call it conspiratorial. So
Yeah, well, it sits in a funny state because if people know a bit about medieval history, they know Britons exist, they know these texts exist. It's not a surprise to them. But just purely sort of when and it's kind of easy for me to forget sometimes about how I was when I didn't know. I always had an interest in history. I always think I knew a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So just gonna jump past Ross a minute. Let's have a look at this one. So these are the archaeological ages in Britain. They're a little bit different to say the Mid-East ones. Because everything's a bit earlier there. They started using copper earlier, they started using bronze earlier, blah, blah, blah.
right.
So this is the sort of Stonehenge era in the Neolithic.
And those were
Um,
the Celtics brought
Before that,
before
these are like Anatolian
that. Okay.
farmers that have, so say, slowly spread across Europe. That's funny, actually. So obviously, Britain's covered in huge megalithic monuments from this time.
Right.
When you speak to British archaeologists, it's the first adjective they use to describe this culture. Farmers,
Not megalith.
not megalith builders.
Yeah.
Farmers. It is important to distinguish them from the hunter-gatherers that came before, but it also doesn't distinguish them from anyone who's come since,
So the
who've
so
all
the
been farmers.
so the emergence of agriculture did coincide with the emergence of megaliths.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
but there's all sorts of things that could be earlier. They found like einkorn wheat, which is like a raised wheat in the Isle of Wight area, like 1,000 years before the Neolithic was meant to be started. So there's going to be change in the future, I think, with these dates anyway. So
But
um,
regardless, it fits the pattern that the uh,
absolutely,
most impressive architecture, in a sense, I mean, was the oldest. It's fascinating.
yeah, yeah, and it's interesting. Something I think worth saying as well about this period is because I'm really interested in the Neolithic as well. I mean, you can't not be really,
Right. Right.
but um, is that it's although like Stonehenge and Avebury and places like that, and we do have loads of great stone monuments. Really, I think what typifies this period is dirt moving. It's much more like ancient North America.
Right.
Banks and ditches. And banks and ditches aren't sexy, but they did them in a big way. And like all the henge monuments, they might have some big stone circles, but around that will be a massive bank and ditch. Sometimes they've moved much more weight and soil than they've moved in stone. And we have some weird ass monuments which people have no idea what they are.
Yeah. Well,
Like no idea what they are.
moving millions of tons of dirt is still non-trivial. I get that it's not as cool as a pyramid, right? But
Yeah, yeah. It's not as when people are like, oh look, there it is. See in that field, there's a slight like ooh, like
that hill.
yeah. But I'm gonna so generally we use these names for these periods. When you get to this period, so early medieval period. So I put that's sort of like a nice academic way of saying it. But generally, and like the way I was raised, we would go Bronze Age, Iron Age, Romans, and then we go Anglo-Saxons.
Okay.
That's literally just the way we were taught, and you will still see this presented to you. And like you can say this is just science communicators or whatever, but generally this is the feeling and the idea that you get. But that almost completely ignores 200 years of a completely different culture, which dominated this island, especially in the West.
And is it within those 200 years that we find Arthur?
Absolutely. Arthur, you could argue, was at the apotheosis of this culture.
Okay.
So what you find is after the Romans left, as I say, the East kind of fell foul to Saxon piracy. And we did actually have a lot of Irish come in from the West as well. But in Western Britain seems to recover sooner, basically. And you start to find like really posh Byzantine pottery being imported, loads of stuff from Carthage. Still evidence of the use of Latin, inscribed monuments. Christianity continues. And this is what we get to, again, this conspiratorial sort of side of it, is that if you know about it, you know about it. If you don't know about it, you could almost never know that it ever existed. It's something you have to go looking for rather than just being what's sort of served up to you.
And do you ascribe a motivation to that?
Well, unfortunately, it just comes down to essentially imperial politics.
Okay.
Is that the Britons were the dominant culture on the island for a long time. So when the Saxons started really asserting themselves as the major power, there is an issue with, what's the word I'm looking for? Not provenance, but your legal reasons for your claim to power.
Okay,
essentially.
Sure. Yeah, the narrative has to make sense, right? If you're going to be in
absolutely.
charge. Yeah.
Yeah. So we don't.
I'm sorry, I feel like a bad student here. It's just so new and
No, 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 it's
complicated.
right.
So the Saxons, these were sort of the Romanized
No,
leftovers.
they were
Roman.
Germanics.
They were
So
Germanic.
they were Germanic tribes, yeah. So they were, I mean, I don't like to say, they probably weren't illiterate, but they weren't Latin users. They were still pagan at the time.
Okay.
The Britons, though, would have been, this is the interesting bit. So, oh,
Oh, here we go.
we're going backwards.
But they were Eastern, the Saxons.
Yeah, Saxons came in from the east. They came in from sort of the main continent, from sort of Germany area. Oh, oh, that's Lud. So this is kind of interesting. So this is on the left here. We've got a map, and this is from like the original peoples of Britain from Welsh tradition. So this is just from literary tradition.
Okay.
You've got the Cymry. This is the Welsh name for themselves. It is probably the mainstream idea is it's from a word like Cumbrogi or something. It's like comrade,
Okay.
like a yeah, a brother, a compatriot. That's a
Yeah.
good word. And then we have Lloiga here on the right, which is could be like the country of the moon or something like that. And then this map on the left here, you have the pre-Roman British nations, and then on the right you have pre-Roman British nations. But the ones in red here, they minted coins, so
Hmm.
they're much more like their European counterparts. And then obviously on the far right, as we've said before, we've got the sort of the density of Roman finds, Roman cities, Roman towns, things like that. And can you see how they all kind of have very similar divides?
Yeah, very.
Yeah.
Is there a
So
geographical reason for that or
these are basically lower flatlands in the
okay.
east. So
Okay.
this is good. This is good for growing crops. This is good for minerals and grazing animals.
Got it.
Um, so so obviously Welsh tradition, much later Welsh tradition, clearly struck on something because there is definitely a difference between these lower flatland people,
Right.
and probably their relationship to the continent is what makes it a bit different. I can't even remember where we were going with this, but
Um
uh,
just
but
just
so
is there a
yeah,
motivation behind this basically this sort of erasure of these 200 years?
yeah. So the other problem, so it comes on several fronts. So one is the political aspect. Um, People there don't want there to be a great flourishing of the Britons. People don't want there to be a time of Arthur because it was the halt of the Saxon incursion. Basically, he stopped things for a good 20 years. He said, right, no, this isn't happening.
Right.
And also because it comes with a whole other. Arthur's like the cherry on the icing on the cake.
Right.
Do
Right.
you know what I mean? Of a
Yeah.
whole culture, a whole complex, ornate, beautiful culture. He's just sort of like the little cherry on the top.
Right.
And this is not something that was good for English dominance. English dominance kind of seeks to move away from that sort of thing. So Alan Wilson and Baron Blackett, who really brought all the sort of Welsh Arthur stuff back into the forefront, they argued that a lot of it was to do with so the revolutions in the 16th and 17th century. Britain had already gone through a civil war or two before the French had their revolution. There was a huge amount of political change. It was absolutely crazy. And so, therefore, certain types of nationalism were seemed wanted to be incredibly discouraged by the powers in Britain.
Yeah.
They didn't want these sort of identities, and even during the English Civil War 100 years ago, there were groups of people going around calling themselves Trojans,
Mm.
right? So this was not. So there was a big change in British academia around this time, And this is when they believed, we started labeling everyone in the Western Isles as Celts rather than trying to differentiate between them. And when the Saxon narrative really became the major thing. Another change was in academia in the 60s and 70s, when in post-war Britain, when Arthur and stuff became people were very interested in again because of a surge of nationalism, probably.
Right.
Suddenly in academia, we're like, oh no, we don't want to talk about kings and stuff. We want to just talk about normal people, right? And one of the big things in England was to go and look into the Saxons. So Saxon archaeology became a massive thing. It became really popular, especially because they're really difficult to find because they were using, organic materials that rot easily and
Right.
all that sort of stuff. Another problem was the fact, and this is a major issue again, and it's to do with the record keeping, is that this time of Arthur, this 5th, 6th century AD, this is the classic Dark Ages, as it was
Right.
called. So, and as I said earlier, there aren't a lot of documents directly from the period. We're dealing with a lot of late information. So it then becomes much easier in the sort of modern wake of like the way German classicists look at manuscripts and things, where everything becomes highly critical and reductive. Where if there isn't, if unless we have something really solid, we just completely reject it, basically. And so much gets. I think this sort of reductive reasoning is almost as speculative as any other sort of speculating, where it's like, oh, in the absence of evidence, there is just a complete absence,
Sure.
rather than in the absence of evidence, this might have been the case or this might have been the case.
Well, and there's an absence of evidence if you selectively choose to ignore certain pieces of evidence, right? So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
So that happens a lot with Geoffrey. And this is why Arthur's become mythologized again, is because what they do is they exclude everything about Arthur that comes with Geoffrey or after Geoffrey. So then you're just left with those pre-Geoffrey bits and bobs. And then you can make sweeping generalizations about them. The most common one is that all the pre-Geoffrey mentions of Arthur are they're mythological. There's some sort of fantastical element to it, and that's just a literary reading. I mean, half of them just aren't like that at all.
Hmm.
But because they say it with such confidence, like, oh, he's just some shadowy figure. It's like, no, that's just your reading of it. That's just
I could be wrong, but you're right. It doesn't ring true, because you think of myths and you're generally not mythologizing about, you know, someone who certainly could be real, right? This isn't Zeus. This isn't,
hmm,
Apollo, right? We're mythologizing about a king. Kings exist,
yeah,
and a recent king, not a
yeah,
king from 5,000 years ago or some mythical figure from, thousands of years ago. This would have been hundreds of years ago, right? Some of these earlier
absolutely.
sources. Okay. Okay.
So another argument that's used is that Arthur was invented by the Welsh in order to create this great king figure. But it seems so unnecessary because Welsh mythology is literally freaking chock a block with heroes. I
Okay.
mean, like they before and like I've got a few together. We got Brutus up here on the left. We've got Beli Mawr, who is either a first century king of Britain, but also related to a sort of sun god Apollo like figure. We got Cadwallader. This is 100 years after Arthur. He's hugely famous. He appears next to Arthur on stained glass windows in cathedrals and things. And even some women. We got Nestfer Therese here. She's known as the Helen of Wales, the most beautiful woman in Wales in the 11th century. So, like, and what Welsh is such a as I say, ornate culture, full of these heroes. You do not need to invent Arthur. Like they've just got so much, and yeah, it's such a. I just don't get that one either. But
It's one
what
of
the
those
Welsh
things.
do
yeah,
Well, sorry, what they do is they mythologize. It's the other way round. I don't think they've historicized their myth with Arthur. They've mythologized their history, which is what they do with all of their historical figures, like consistently. Like
such a great point. Yep, absolutely.
there's something else.
There sort of needs to be like and this is what science is supposed to be about, is a standard by which, you determine historicity. Like if there's, it sounds like multiple sources within a couple hundred years of this person existing. I'm sure there are many other historical figures who we assume are real people
Absolutely.
based on a similar level of evidence. So,
That's the other thing is that when even getting into these later documents, you have lots and lots and lots of references to the milieu, the context of Arthur, right? And this includes his family members, his acquaintances, people who served with him, his enemies as well.
hmm.
And what you end up with is a stack of people, events, dates, which is you can go through academic to academic, and they'll go legendary, fictional, historical, legendary, fictional, historical, legendary, fictional, historical, and they'll all divide them up differently. They
Hmm.
all have different opinions on when it comes down, especially right down to the details. They've all got completely fucking different ideas. I would say there's no consensus whatsoever. The idea of any sort of consensus about this period is a real illusion. And the historical people are so deeply intertwined with what they then call the legendary or the fictional
Yeah.
that it's like, how do you tease this apart? Like, how can you be like, oh, this bit is fictional, but this bit, this bit, and this is all right. This guy's historical. St. David is the patron saint of Wales. He's a really big name there. They call him Dewi Sant. He's recorded as the maternal uncle of King Arthur. Like, why would you do that? Like, why would you do that if there's no? I
So,
don't know.
so something, tell me what you think about this. And sorry for just hypothesizing on the fly here, but you see kind of a similar, and I'm not conflating the two at all, but you see a similar thing with like the historical person of Jesus, right?
Yeah,
It's like, well, at first, everyone is a mythical figure, but then you learn, okay, well, yes, Pontius Pilate was a real person who did rule that area, Herod, and
yeah,
there's graffiti in Rome depicting the crucifixion in the first century. So the Romans thought it was real at the time. And then it builds and builds and builds. And you just find that there's an incredible level of suspicion of the historical person, not the
mm,
not the religious figure, but the historical figure, because of who they claim the religious figure was, right?
yes,
And so I
yeah,
wonder with King Arthur, because of this other stuff like Merlin, or I don't know what
yeah.
other
Holy Grail, yeah,
this, yes, because of that, there's like this super critical, this high bar that needs to be passed just to establish his historicity,
yeah.
which isn't, it's
So
not
yeah, so
appropriate. They're two different
that's
things.
really good. Like, I was listening to one of the Book of the Damned Snake Bros.
Yeah,
So, and they were talking about I can't remember what the word they used. It's about like acceptability or something like that.
sure, yeah.
And it's like, oh, there's nothing wrong. I can't remember the way they put it exactly, but it was about like, oh, I can't discuss this subject because the subject is unacceptable. It's nothing to do with the
Right.
date, or and I'll just completely ignore it. And Arthur's like crept into the unacceptable. That's the interesting bit over the last like 50, 60 years or so, because you can go back to a certain point and people would say, yeah, he's real. If you go back to the 1920s Welsh textbooks, they'll tell you even who he is and where he lived and everything.
Wow.
Like they used to teach that in schools in the 1920s, right?
So when
Um,
does that other stuff creep in, like the Holy Grail, the Merlin stuff? I mean, was that always there, or was that added later?
Interesting. So,
All right, here we
so
go.
certain bits we can really point to. So, for instance, what's a good one? The Round Table doesn't really appear in any Welsh legend or anything like that. It seems to be introduced in one of the sort of later romances.
Oh, that's interesting
Um,
because it's of all the things, it's such a mundane one, you know?
I know, right? And you know, there's still some other bits which are suggestive, maybe not. The sword in the stone, I think Mallory is the first, and Mallory's quite late, so that's Mort d'Arthur, which is like 16th century. So, and I think he's the first to mention the sword in the stone. There's not really anything about that before
Interesting.
him. The Grail is interesting because, well, especially since certain popular authors, the Grail is linked in with the bloodline of Christ.
Yeah.
And this chap here, who's Joseph of Arimathea.
Oh, wow.
And you may have heard that Joseph of Arimathea is associated with Glastonbury in England.
I tell me, I don't know anything. Tell me.
Well, we would be taught, you know, you might hear about Glastonbury, but there's all sorts of links with Joseph of Arimathea. There's you know, the missing years of Christ as well.
Right.
Like, yeah, yeah. So Britain is one of the places where they make a claim that he came.
No
Mainly
way.
riding on the fact that the thought that Joseph of Arimathea was a tin merchant,
Okay.
and the West Country in Britain has massive tin deposits and has been trading for thousands of years with the rest of the world. But there is definitely a lot of tradition before and after Geoffrey of Monmouth about apostolic Christianity in Britain, not just Joseph of Arimathea, but Philip, St. Paul, St. Peter. Is he called Zebediah? Is it Zebediah? Or someone like that as well is also said to have come to Britain.
And so for
Um,
people who don't know, this would have been was he a disciple of Jesus, Joseph?
yeah, I mean, some say Joseph of Arimathea was his uncle.
Okay, okay.
I think in the Bible it says his uncle, but loads of people speculate, you know, brother or
And he was responsible for the burial of Jesus.
yes, yeah,
And
yeah, yeah. It was his cave, I believe,
okay.
and he negotiated with Pilate as well. Because this is the other thing is whether the historical Jesus survived the crucifixion and where
That's
did he go afterwards as well.
that's sort of the Rosicrucian perspective is that he lived and that the disciples took him from the tomb and revived him and he
Yeah,
had children and yeah, exactly. Yep.
yeah. So we've got some myths of that, but you get some of the Welsh saints. St. Cadoc. Cadoc's a really his life, the life of St. Cadoc, is really important because it has pre Geoffrey of Monmouth mentions of Arthur. It has genealogies for his a bit of his father's family and his mother's family on two sides, I think, and they show the genealogy of Arthur, I believe, and also the other one goes back to Anna, sister of Mary,
Mm.
and Anna, sister of Mary, is said to have married a British king,
Wow, I didn't realize there were that, you know,
and that's from like the ninth century AD. So
yeah, it's amazing. I've never even really connected these stories before. Like I said, I
yeah,
know so little about this topic, so this is fascinating. So,
I, I knew so little before. It's amazing. It's like it's kind of like dotted around in the landscape. You
mhm.
know, you see the place names and things like that, but it's so easy to just not know anything about. It's so easy.
Yeah, and you just have these like cultural references to things like, oh, King Arthur and the Holy Grail.
Mm.
You never stop and think about, wait a second, the Holy Grail. Well,
Yeah, yeah,
how are these two stories connected? You know,
yeah.
so
There's an interesting so there's a late romance from Wales called The Welsh Holy Grail. This is our first native version of that, and that one's well odd for all your comet stuff as well. You know, there's stories of they're all sat there having a banquet, and then all the windows and doors blow open, and there's a huge noise, and then it's daylight for 2 weeks, and then the land is completely uninhabited, and then also the Grail kind of the description of the Grail, it sounds like a Foo Fighter. Like it literally just like a ball of light that like bulbs into the room and floats around and then flies out the window. It's so weird.
I again, I'm going to keep admitting my ignorance here. Well, I don't even know how is the Holy Grail described originally.
I mean, I don't think I've brought that. I've bought like huge stacks of books down, but I don't think I've bought. It's classic. The one thing I didn't bring down is the one thing I'd bring up. But
Right.
yeah, no, I mean, it's described variously in various legends, but definitely in that Welsh Holy Grail, there's one bit where it's literally described as a floating ball of light, which like bobs its way
Well, that's
around the.
fascinating. So,
Yeah, it's really odd.
so how much weight do you put on this particular idea that either there's a like a direct genealogical connection or tangential connection between Jesus or his inner circle and King Arthur?
I think the apostolic, the early first century AD Christianity, Britain stuff really has legs. I think it's
Wow, that's cool.
whether it's directly to the Holy Family. I think it's definitely a possibility that we had apostles here.
Right.
I don't see why that's far fetched. I don't know why that's a problem. These people were essentially the movers and shakers of their time, and during the first century of the Roman Empire, you could get about Europe and Mediterranean relatively easy peasy.
Right.
And Britain, especially in the early days of Christianity, would have still been outside of Rome.
Interesting.
So it's kind of possibly a good place to go if you want to get outside of Roman control.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, Rome was not kind to these early folks, so it
no.
makes sense to yeah.
And then, like, some people give it as possibly a reason that sparked the Claudian invasion in the first place, 10 years after the death of Jesus.
Oh, is that when it happened? Wow.
Yeah, I mean that's one idea. I don't know. I mean, it all gets it all gets whipped up in politics. So there's also much older traditions that Britain is 10 tribes. 10 tribes of Israel.
Oh,
And so, part of the argument is that apostles or the Holy Family would have sought refuge here because there would have been Hebrews here, essentially. Um, I'm not so sure about that. I could go either way on it, really. I'm quite happy holding both in state until something pushes me one way or the other. But one thing is for sure is that there is plenty of prehistoric connections to the Middle East and Britain, especially what we call Phoenicians and stuff like that. There is a strong connection. So,
what's the mainstream idea of when, Christianity came to this area?
late 4th century, they say that's when we start to get what we would say as recognizably Christian archaeology is in the late 4th century. And they say it came over with Roman traders, but this is so diaphanous. That's just like a reason. It doesn't mean anything. There's no historical record of Roman traders bringing Christianity over here. By the 3rd century, Britain had already produced a guy called Pelagius, who basically rocked the Christian world by saying that he didn't believe in original sin. And it was called the Pelagian heresy, and it was a big deal. So for Britain to have produced a Christian thinker by the 3rd century that was completely, rocking the philosophical foundations of Christian Europe, I feel like there must have been some sort of Christian tradition in Britain for quite a while before that. But not necessarily. The other thing is say that's recognizable Christian archaeology, but what does 1st century Christianity look like?
Right. Yeah, I think people lose
What do you
track.
look for?
Like, a lot can change in 100, 200 years,
Yeah,
Look how much our world has
absolutely.
changed in 20 or 30. So, yeah.
Mm, yeah, absolutely. And you know, catastrophic change like an invasion can certainly change things as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, yeah.
I
Um,
mean, that's a fascinating idea that I would love to speculate and daydream about, this idea that, an important, at least part of the royal family or their descendants went to this area. in that
Oh,
kingdom
right.
that might emerge
Yeah.
from that circle. That's fascinating. And we don't need to talk about it anymore if you don't have more stuff to share about it. But that's incredibly
I think
interesting.
that the interest. So, Prince Madoc, are we talking about?
What's
Or,
that?
are we talking about Prince Madoc? Are we talking about your area in particular?
Oh, I
Like,
don't know.
have you not heard of King Arthur in America? This is kind of interesting.
Say that again.
King Arthur in America?
No, I haven't heard about this. Tell me.
Oh, so there's a Welsh tradition about a guy called Prince Madoc
Okay.
who discovered America.
No, no way.
And the thing about Madoc is that really we know about him in a big way. He's really famous because of our old mate John Dee again.
Okay.
So this is at a time when a lot of European nations are trying to make claim to America. So a lot of people will just go, the Tudors were trying to claim America. They made up this Prince Madoc guy. Bish bash bosh. It's a load of rubbish, you know. But there's some problems that the Prince Madoc they kind of pick out from the genealogies doesn't quite fit. He does fit very well with the Tudor family genealogies,
Okay.
but other things about him don't quite make sense. There seems to be poetry from before his time of people talking about Prince Madoc's voyages.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Right, okay. And you can find another Madoc in the genealogies, and he's called Madoc Ap, which means son of Uther.
Oh.
Uther Pendragon being the father of Arthur.
Oh, wow. Very cool.
So possibly a brother or half brother or step brother of Arthur. And this is certainly the argument of Wilson and Blackett, and they go into that in great deal, is they think that Prince Madoc could be a 6th century figure. And they've got lots of stuff going for that. Again, it's something where it's not my field particularly, so I can't.
Yeah, sure, sure.
You know, I think it's really interesting, and but I can't. I don't know where to go with it. But that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Um,
When did the Danish and the Vikings start messing with England and the
so 8th, 9th century,
okay,
really.
much later. Okay.
Yeah,
Because I knew
yeah,
there's that idea that the Vikings were the first people to discover the
yes,
New world, but that would have been hundreds of years later. Okay.
yeah. I reckon the Phoenicians were probably over it.
Oh,
I,
that's so cool. Yeah. I love
I wouldn't be surprised. They were bloody everywhere, really.
it. Well, they were called the Sea Peoples for a reason.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, okay, I don't want to disrupt your flow here, so
yeah.
get back to your slides. I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. So I think the next thing I was just going to say, sort of about the idea we had a period. I mean, it's come in and out of fashion, but let's say in the 1950s, we had a period where people said, yes, Arthur was real. He was a historical king of the 6th century. We're going to go looking for him. And they even did lots of excavations looking for him. Um,
Excavations where?
so a couple of places. So one of them is called Tintagel, which is in Cornwall,
Okay.
which is given as the birthplace of Arthur in Geoffrey of Monmouth. It was really interested because all the critics before that would just say Tintagel's just a 10th century castle. Geoffrey just included it because some rich guy had just built a castle there or something like that. They did the excavations and they found lots and lots of 6th century stuff. In fact, they found the highest concentration of Mediterranean, like really high class Mediterranean pottery that they found anywhere else in Britain.
Interesting.
Yeah. Another place was Cadbury Castle. Cadbury's long been suggested for a Camelot. They again found something 6th century, but it wasn't particularly impressive. But it's interesting anyway because I think gives us a good idea of who these Britons were. Is they were like the least Romanized people of the island. But then when the Saxons came in, they were the most Romanized. You essentially still had a Roman state in Britain when the rest of Western Roman Empire had been completely destroyed by the Germanics,
Wow.
essentially.
Wow.
This is, I think, this is another thing which is kind of a bit tetchy for certain ideologies over certain time. Ones who want to say, oh, the Romans are the greatest, but the Britons were just ignorant savages, and the Romans civilized us and brought us education and all this sort of things like that. It doesn't really fit well to then say, oh, but then continuing on, Britain was the only place where Roman society kind of held together.
Right.
But the only
That's interesting though, and it's kind of logical. Like you have this vast empire that is overextended and then it's invaded and conquered. It would make sense for the conquering forces to not be able to conquer the fringes of this vast empire.
absolutely, yeah,
And it makes sense for
absolutely,
them to remain.
yeah. And this is kind of like a an interesting thing about the geography of Britain is that there's an idea that the powers of the uplands can basically police the southeast,
Mm.
but they can only do it if they can control certain key points where you leave the uplands. So I heard a really interesting statement saying that basically power is always in the southeast of Britain, but only at the behest of the northwest.
There's so many
So,
Game of Thrones references I can make right now, but I'll leave it alone. So we got King's
absolutely.
Landing down in London. I got you.
I mean, yeah, I mean, loads of it comes from it. I mean,
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
Bran is one of the most famous names in British mythology, and
Yeah.
um, but then right, so then we move on to like the 70s and stuff. In the 70s, you could say that Arthur was real, but you would have to qualify it with like, oh, but he was just a regional king. That then his reputation got blown out of proportion. He
Okay.
got he got mixed with the mythological Arthur, and then suddenly everyone was talking about Arthur. But he was just some one king from one little area, and all his
This is
stuff happened in one little area.
this seems to be how these things happen. It's iterative, right? So at first he's real and grand, and then he's just real, and then soon he's mythological, and then
Hmm.
soon he's mythological and grand, right?
Fictional, yeah,
Got his
yeah.
magic, he's got swords and stones, and blah blah blah.
Hmm.
You think a big part of that was the Hollywoodization of this legend? It must be, right? Because as soon as something's like Hollywood, scientists all of a sudden are like, "Oh yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It
not
turns them
really how
off.
it
Yeah.
happened."
Well, honestly, it started with Jeffrey because although this is a oh
Really?
shit
Wow.
crashing around. Although this is all part of Welsh culture. They weren't a culture for annals and chronologies. I mean, it's the land of song. It's a culture of poetry. So this is the Druidic culture.
Wow. Yeah.
Everything is memorized. It's
So
bardic culture.
in other words, England, Britain, they had their own complicated reasons for wanting Arthur to become a myth. It has nothing to do with fancy
Yeah.
moves with Clive
Well,
Owen.
yeah, I think it was long on the way to be, and then of course, and then we had all the medieval romance writers. They just they went off on a real tangent. Now, I'm not saying there isn't something. This is what I find really interesting about the historical Arthur as well. Is when you boil it down and you go right, let's take all this stuff off. That won't help us find a historical Arthur. You've got your historical Arthur, and you're happy with that, maybe. What's all this other stuff trying to tell us? Why is there a Holy Grail floating around the room? What's going on? And that's when we get to, Randall will say alchemical ideas. Um, there's also, I definitely think, just cosmic ideas in general. I think there's so much cosmic lore written into this stuff. It's unbelievable. And some of that is possibly very, very ancient. Um,
Wow. So we have kind of this druidic culture mixing with potentially early Christianity and Roman culture, and then from this Arthur emerges.
Yeah.
How much do we know about, like, even in these earlier sources that Jeffrey is drawing from? Like, how much do we actually know about him as a person?
We know a bit about Geoffrey. He was probably like half Welsh, half Norman, or half Breton, half Norman.
Okay.
Um, so do you remember I said you sort of said about his sources
Right.
earlier? And I said, oh, he tells us everything we need to know.
Right.
He really does. He says, I got this old Welsh book which my friend told me to copy, and he's like,
Interesting.
but I don't like these boring things, so I made it fun,
Okay. Okay.
right? And I wrote in flowery language and stuff.
Well,
And we should also
like,
expect there's
that's
a
like,
proper. Go
yeah,
on.
that's incredibly important. I mean, he's admitting, okay, yeah, I jazzed it up a bit, but this is the source material that describes this.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So, but he says he got it from this one Welsh book, and people denied the existence of this book for a long time. They said
Hmm.
he's drawing from Nennius, which I think I showed you earlier, a number of Roman sources, and then he's just making the rest of the shit up, right?
Hmm.
But then you get this. This says the Chronicle of the Kings of Britain. It's sometimes known as Brute. Oh yeah, the Brute Tacilio. Tacilio was a 7th century saint. Brute is what we call what the Britons called their histories, and it's because it started with Brutus, so it would be the
Oh,
Brute.
that's fascinating.
Um, and what's really interesting about there's quite a few Tacilio manuscripts. They're very undervalued, but one of them has a little note on the beginning that says, "I, Walter, Archdeacon of Oxford, who is the guy that Geoffrey claimed gave him his Welsh book, said, gave this book to a friend to be translated into Latin, and in my old age, I've translated it from Latin back into Welsh." And he's put his little stamp on it. So
Wow.
essentially, he gave Geoffrey his book to be translated into Latin. Geoffrey made his copy, but then for some reason or another, he didn't get his original one back. So he had to translate Geoffrey's copy back into Welsh. But so we don't have Geoffrey's original book, but we kind of have the next best thing, which is a note from the guy saying, "Yeah, this did happen, and this is the best we've got." Right, basically.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly, I guess, is a mystery, but as far as chains of custody go, that's pretty nice.
It's not bad, is it?
Right.
And but people will just be like, "No, it's just a copy of Geoffrey. It's just a Welsh copy of Geoffrey."
Huh.
But there's loads of interesting differences. For instance, all of the fun stuff isn't in it. Just like Geoffrey said, where he said, "I'm going to make this more fun."
Right.
And this doesn't have all the like blow by blow sword fighting accounts or
Sure.
the romantic overtures that one king made to his queen and stuff like that. That's just not in here. It's also interesting because it uses the names rather than Geoffrey's sort of bizarre, sometimes Latin versions. It's got Welsh names, and a lot of them relate to characters from Welsh tradition, which appear in much earlier tradition as well. So
So is that treated as a important source document? No, it seems like it should be, obviously. I guess that's the
it's
case you're making.
only in as much as it's an old Welsh manuscript, and so people are like, well, it's a value as a manuscript. It can tell us how people wrote in different ways
Sure.
and how language involved and what paper they were
Right,
using.
right. It
Blah, blah,
tells
blah,
us
you
more
know?
about the Welsh than it does the people that it's written about. Okay.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
but putting that aside for a second, like how much does it actually tell us about Arthur? Like, we know his birthplace potentially, we know his father.
Yeah.
Do we have a pretty good understanding of his life or not really?
So yeah, I mean, kind of. Yeah, it does give us an overview. He was this idea that he was ascended to kingship quite young, probably about the age of 15. That there would have been possibly some sort of succession war that he might have had to fight in order to secure his position. Then a series of major campaign against the Saxons, and then pretty much a big period of peace. And then, the campaign of the Saxons ending in the Battle of Baden, Battle of Baden being a very famous Arthurian battle. And then period of peace, and then he died in a civil war, it seems, against his nephew Mordred.
Mm.
That's the general, bones of it, which you see repeated again and again throughout romantic
So
stories.
it's a fair amount of detail with real geographical locations and
Yeah,
at least some real people. It sounds like people argue about who's real, who's not.
yeah,
It would be an odd story to make up. Um,
yeah,
no, what 200 years after the fact that this is
yeah.
George's book. So 200 years after. So this would be like me writing about, I guess, George Washington. So I or not someone even closer. Ulysses Grant. So I write a
Mm.
book about Ulysses Grant, but I just fiction. It's like you said, I make a fan fiction version of his life, but I still have him interacting with the real people who he would have interacted at the time,
Hmm.
and then and then it just seems strange. I'm not saying it's
Yeah.
impossible, obviously, because it's the mainstream view, right?
I
So it
mean,
could be true.
essentially, in the mainstream eyes, Jeffrey is a bloody creative polymath who constructed this incredibly complex and believable history out of a
Right.
vast range of source materials, and
Right.
which is ridiculous because in other cases where you have like let's say you'll have a certain character mentioned in Welsh tradition in one place and one time, and another character with the same name mentioned, and you go, well, do you know what? These people could be the same people, and then someone will say, no, no, you see his name spelt slightly differently. That's a different person. So one guy copying a manuscript doesn't have enough creative ability to change a single letter in a certain name. Yet Geoffrey of Monmouth can completely construct this entire fictitious history of 1,000 years out of his ass, basically.
Yeah, this is, obviously something I've been learning from listening to the Snake Bros and Randall and all the Graham, all these people. It and I've said this to Alfredo too. It just seems like archaeology and the related disciplines, right?
Hmm.
It doesn't really strike me as a hard science.
Oh no, it's not at all, is
It's
it?
it's like this wouldn't fly in my line of work, right? Like
Hmm.
in neuroscience, you wouldn't kind of come up. I mean, don't get me wrong, it does happen, but you don't come up with the theory and then just pursue that theory at all costs. You have many competing theories, and you have people who are proponents of the different theories, but you don't generally like my field, Alzheimer's. There is like there's like a leading hypothesis, sure.
Hmm.
Then there's like 10 other competing hypotheses that are all considered mainstream, and they're all very different. And so we recognize that many of these are probably wrong, but we don't just assume that the leading hypothesis is correct, right?
Yeah.
With archaeology, it seems like there is a field approved theory.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's not allowed to be mainstream competing theories. Like forget about the
Hmm.
fringe, right? Like normally you should have like 10 different competing mainstream ideas for each,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
when you're talking about something that happened this long, like with neuroscience, we're talking about stuff we can look at today. It's right in front of us. We can look at the brain. Like this is something that happened 1,000 years ago. There should be 100 mainstream explanations that
Yeah.
are vying to be the most correct, right?
And I would say sometimes I do think this is a bit of an illusion created by the history and archaeology. What's the word I'm looking for? The distributors of information, journalists,
Sure,
essentially,
the gatekeepers, yeah.
the gatekeepers. Yeah, I think there is an issue there, and I think where it's interesting with where we're coming from is although there are the nasties in archaeology like Flynn Dibble and that, and I think when you get down to this period, like what we're talking about now, like people arguing about the places, the people, the historiosity and things like that. When you get to the real deep, the people working on it, although there might be a general like, oh, we think Arthur is fictional. With all of this stuff, there is a lot that's still open up in the air, and there's a lot of disagreement.
Oh, that's
Uh,
interesting.
but then this is really interesting when it comes to this
Yeah,
idea of pseudo history or pseudo archaeology.
right.
The idea being like, oh, you're generating or you're thinking or you're pushing pseudo archaeology history because you don't understand that we actually have this consensus which you can't access maybe because it's behind paywalls or you're not an expert, so you just don't see it, or you get it in bits and bobs from TV and from
Yep.
visiting places like that. But that's just not true. There is no consensus behind the paywall. So
That is interesting.
you
Wow.
know, why can't I speculate at the period?
Okay,
How
I
can we be
actually
called pseudo archaeologists when there is no consensus to
this is actually such an insightful point, and I just want to retract everything I just said because you're right. I see this all the time, at least in health sciences, is that the actual people doing the research, the people scanning the brain, drawing the blood, writing the paper, they're incredibly open-minded. And
Mm,
they're actually pretty honest about how little they know. But then there's this other layer of like science advocate or science communicator style person who maybe was once a professor or even is still a professor that sort of distills everything and says, this is the explanation.
yeah,
And then
yeah.
so the people actually doing the work behind the scenes don't even really have his confidence at all, right?
Yeah.
But he's presenting this incredibly confident view. And then if someone shares a view that maybe the original scientist would actually be pretty interested in discussing, they'll be called a pseudoscientist,
Yeah, yeah,
pseudoscience,
yeah,
right? And so it sounds like that's what you're saying. Like there's this scientific journalism
yeah,
layer that kind of it presents a huge problem actually. Like it's the reason why we have this phrase like trust the science or the science says.
mm,
It's bizarre, and it's not a view that I would say most scientists share in it, but unfortunately it's the field of science that is looking bad
yeah,
because of these scientific communicators. And so it
yeah,
sounds
yeah. Absolutely, yeah. It rubs off on them, doesn't it? It makes the whole idea, the whole concept of science look bad just by the way that some people try and present ideas. And
I don't get where that goes. Like, why is there this? I think it's the desperation to have understanding. Like, you just
yes,
want to be
oh yes,
certain. You want to be certain in what happened, and so you have this like white knight who says, "This is what science says," and you go, "Okay." And then you have
mm-hmm.
someone like you asking just real legitimate questions that, like you're saying, maybe a lot of archaeologists would be like, "Yeah, I don't know, maybe." And now you're a pseudo scientist for asking these
Yeah.
questions. If you went to like a random person on the street, well, first of all, they say, "Why are you talking to me?" But if you brought
Who
up
are
this
you?
idea about Arthur, would that be like crazy or no? What's
Yeah,
the
most people, I would say now the general opinion today, most people will just say, "Oh no, it's just fiction." So
okay?
because
Like what?
again,
Like you
like you
believe
said
in
earlier,
dragons, kind of.
yeah, yeah, exactly, yeah, yeah, they'll just jump to something like that. And I think what turns a lot of people off the idea of historical, why a lot of people prefer the idea of a cosmic Arthur or a mythological Arthur, is because I think for some people a medieval war leader doesn't push their buttons for Arthur.
Hmm.
So they'd kind of rather be like, oh no, there is no historical Arthur. It's just the cosmic. It's pagan. It's all this and that. It's not Roman and Christian. No, we don't like Roman and Christian. We like pagan and Celtic and all this sort of stuff. And these are
Well,
false
there's
oppositions anyway. So
there's something really fascinating there. Before I go on a tangent, do you have any more slides? I don't want to keep tangenting.
there's
Okay,
something I
sorry.
just want to do a
Show
little
me, show me.
tiny bit on historical Arthur, which will just be I just want to just have a look at this image here.
Oh,
See if
this
we.
looks cool. What is this
Oh,
from?
oh, oh. This is from a book called The Lives of the Saints. The Lives of the Saints is it's a collection of summaries of information on people recorded as saints during this period. So where and when is Arthur is really important. So Geoffrey of Monmouth and Chrétien de Troyes are the de Troyes, sorry. Do you know what? I started saying de Troyes as a joke, and then I keep on saying it all the time now, and I'm like, oh, it's actually de Troyes. Anyway, he they mention Arthur's principal city, and it's not Camelot. Chrétien is actually the first to mention Camelot, but he kind of just mentions it as like, he's like, oh, on some random Christian holiday, like, I don't know, like, I don't know, Ash Wednesday or something, Arthur spent the night in Camelot. And then from then on, lots of the other romanticists pick up on Camelot. But
Got it.
Arthur's principal city, according to Chrétien and Geoffrey, is a place called Caerleon.
Mm,
Now, Caerleon's a very real place. It's in Newport, near Newport in southeast Wales. It's a Roman legionary city. And I'll give you, I mean, well, if someone says, "Oh, where do you think Camelot is?" I say, "Are you interested in knowing where Camelot is? Are you interested in finding Arthur's favorite court? Are you interested in finding an ancient walled city that would have been renovated in the early medieval time, which sat in a plain by a river, by a really big trading port, which on the hill behind it was an ancient prehistoric fortress which had been renovated for the early medieval period?" You'd be like, yeah, that sounds like Camelot. That sounds cool as fuck.
man.
That is what Caerleon is. That is literally what Caerleon is. It would have been this awesome. It's got a big amphitheater as well, which in tradition was known as King Arthur's Round Table for a long time.
Oh, that makes sense. When you mentioned this brief movement to find archaeological evidence for Arthur, did that
Yeah.
ever occur in this city that you're discussing right now?
So you can go to Caerleon now and there won't be one mention of Arthur anywhere, which is really sad because the Welsh know that Arthur is Welsh. You know,
Right.
they don't have any bones about, how it comes across in England is very different to how it comes across in Wales. But then, of course, Welsh institutions are heavily, or historically, I'm not going to say they are now, but historically, they would have had to pay a lot of lip service to British and English institutions, to English educational institutions. So how they present their history as well is very much managed in a political way, or at least was. One good way of looking at it is that Wales has more castles than virtually the rest of Northern Europe. It's so the density is crazy, and they've got some really impressive large late medieval castles, which they spend loads and loads and loads of money on it. These castles were known as the Iron Ring, which is essentially the way in which an English king, I think it was Edward II. Oh, anyway, basically the way he brought Wales to its knees. They are invader castles. And yet that's how the Welsh spend their money on their history. And they've got native castles, which are crumbling ruins.
I see what you're saying. Okay.
See, it's all these things that just like tickle your conspiracy guy, like there's nothing so plainly laid out, but you just come across this time and time and time again. Like,
You feel like there might be some sort of motive, is what you're saying.
yeah. It just becomes plain, after a while that there's a clear, like, and this is the way the imperial model is rolled out across the rest, even starting with Ireland, starting with Ireland is the same sort of thing. And then across to Africa and America, you destroy the language, destroy the local culture, you make them like and then we do business.
Yeah, exactly. There's always this, when there's an invasion, there's always this simulating motive, right? Because you need a united culture. You can't have three different culture. I mean, not to get into multiculturalism, but you just you want a unified culture if you want peace, right? You don't want civil war. So it makes sense that you would try to erase and stamp out the history. So wow,
Yes, absolutely.
That's fascinating.
Back to Caerleon.
Yeah, sorry.
It sits between two ancient Welsh kingdoms in South Wales. One called Morgannwg, or Glamorgan, it's called today, and Gwent is the other one. At this time, we have some genealogies of kings from this time. And so basically, the idea is, if you want to find Arthur, we look around for this area, we look around at the kings, and we see if anyone stands out, essentially. And we come to this guy. So in this book, they don't necessarily think this guy is Arthur, but there's some very interesting people in here, as we'll see. And this is who I think is Arthur. It says Athruis here. Um,
Hmm.
he's given as a son of Moric, and then the grandson of a guy called Tudrig. There's some other genealogies which actually give him as a direct son of Tudrig, but I won't go into that for now. Um, now, in this time when this book was written, this was very much accepted that this family were from this time and place. If you ask a academic today, they'll say he's from about 150 years later, based on the most crappiest of arguments, basically. The earliest documents actually put him in this time period. The life of St. Cadoc is another one, because Cadoc had his grandmother was called Marshall. No, was it grandmother or his mother? No, that's Brooken's mother. Hold on. Grandmother, yes, his grandmother was called Marshall,
Okay.
and that was Tudric's daughter. Now, when I came to this, I found it hard trying to sort of get my head around this Athros guy. But this Tudric guy is really interesting because what we know about him fits so well with what we know about Uther Pendragon. Like, so ridiculously well. So much about his life. So
How do we know anything about Pendragon from these same sources?
Yeah, Pendragon's actually something, again, that's another thing that some people say Geoffrey invented, but you can find older Welsh poetry with mention of the word Pendragon. Pendragon is probably a title. It literally means head war leader, so it doesn't mean dragon. Dragon, the Welsh have a word for dragon. It's not dragon, it's draig. And dragon means something like war leader, and pen or means head or lead.
So at some point the names were sort of changed, but they're based on
The names are completely all over the shop.
because that's super common in like biblical archaeology. I mean, the names they hardly sound familiar because they've been translated from different.
Absolutely.
Right?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And we're talking about a number of different languages. So you've got Welsh and Latin. There's no doubt there's some Greek involved in there somewhere because people were just recording things in Greek for centuries anyway. It was just a language of choice, especially earlier on. You've got
so these are Latin
dialect.
These are Latin. These are Latin names that you're showing me here, or these are
there's a mix of Latin and Welsh.
Okay, because Athruis sounds kind of Latin, but I don't know. I know nothing about.
I mean, absolutely, and you certainly get certain names. I mean, like I don't know. So here, this is interesting. You've got Anna. You'll find in all the legends, Anna is Arthur's sister. So you've got here Athruis, and here you've got a sister, Anna.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Meant to marry someone called Amandie, and this is Saint Samson. Saint Samson's a very big, famous saint at the time. Who else have we got on here?
I just got to say, I agree. You've convinced me. Whatever skeptical kind of conspiratorial itch that this has scratched for you, you've managed to spread to me, because I agree. It does seem like this intentional sort of for erasing of something that used to be accepted.
Yeah. I tell you, this one's quite good for that actually. So the guys I was mentioning earlier, Aaron Wilson and Baron Blackett, they wrote a book. This one, The Holy Kingdom, with Adrian Gilbert. I don't know. So it kind of it's a name that gets forgotten. Adrian Gilbert wrote the Orion correlation book with Robert Bauval. And he kind of gets forgotten. You know, everyone knows Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock and all that. And no one really remembers Adrian Gilbert, but he wrote that book with Robert Bauval. And he's written a number of very interesting books. And, you know, again, some of it I can take or leave, but that book with Baron and Blackett is bloody excellent. Because I think Adrian's writing's very good. So his presentation of the information is brilliant. You know, he makes it very digestible. But one thing he does go into a lot as well is the treatment of the Welsh histories in British academia and the various history that may have contributed towards that. Certain events, certain people. I mean, the Tudors were so interesting for it because they were giving with one hand and taking away with the other. You
Mm.
know, on the one hand, Henry VII, the Tudor, was calling his son Arthur because he wanted his son to succeed him,
Okay.
and yeah, and flying a red dragon, and you know, all sorts of really like Arthurian stuff he was involved with. And then on the other hand, he was getting in Polydore Virgil from Italy, who was a popish historian who was writing things like Arthur's nonsense. The British have Trojan fantasies, and we need to rid them of their Trojan fantasies and things like that. It's so the real
Trojan.
politic of that era is so intense. You know, it's like this isn't something that I invented in the Cold War. This is something that's been going on for a long time. This sort of double dealing, insane Orwellian creation of how we think about ourselves and how we present ourselves as a nation to other countries as well. So I think
That's
it's really
fascinating.
interesting that a lot of the information about early humans at the moment is coming out of places like Israel and China,
Right.
because these are countries that want to present certain ideas about themselves abroad, you know.
Yep.
Um, and in Britain in the 19th century and early 20th century, we really wanted to push Roman stuff. So all the money went into all the Roman archaeology in Britain. And,
Yeah.
you know, we were building classical style buildings and things like that, you know.
I mean, you wonder how history will be written about our current time, and I can just guarantee you it will not be what I think. You know, yeah, I can guarantee you it will be something very different from my current perception of the world and the culture and politics. So, yeah, I mean, I just don't have a belief that individuals with complex, familial relations and geographical anchors are invented out of whole cloth. I mean, it just seems like they
Yeah,
must be based on a real person. I don't know.
absolutely.
Um,
Especially one so in depth and so complex. You know, it's not like, oh, we've just duplicated a person because another name's come up or something like that. This is a whole freaking character, you know, and yeah,
yeah,
I totally
and
agree.
it's one thing. Of course, there are immensely creative people. Like, look at Tolkien. Like, someone could hold up the Lord of the Rings and say, well, Frodo wasn't a real person, yet we have all this complex information about his relationships and his geography. There's even invented languages in the book. But
Yeah,
the difference is that, like, with somebody like Arthur, like, the mainstream historians and archaeologists accept that many of these people actually exist, and we can go visit the actual places that are referenced. It's not like Mordor. We can't
yeah,
go
yeah,
visit we can't go visit Mordor. So I see that as like a rebuttal to um, people like Arthur, or other, I keep thinking of Jesus, obviously, because
yeah, yeah, yeah,
I can't help but
absolutely.
seeing the parallels. I mean, I do think that with Jesus, what we had was we have this crazy claim with all sorts of implications, political implications, religious
Mm,
implications, blah blah blah. So you know, you can dismiss the miracles and stuff, right? But a much more effective way of dismissing the miracles would be to eliminate the historicity. Like,
yeah,
if we can show that this person never even existed, then the rest of it is just, who cares,
yeah.
right?
It's irrelevant.
And
Yeah, absolutely, totally
and that
irrelevant. Yeah,
and that was, and less so today, but that really was the effort, right? But then, for whatever reason, um, it does seem like, even I would say most like atheist archaeologists acknowledge that there was a person, who
yeah, probably,
lived,
absolutely, probably.
named, not Jesus, but named something, whatever
Mm,
the translation would be. And it seems like with Arthur, it seems like there is a very similar attempt to erase the historicity that succeeded,
yeah,
for the most part,
absolutely.
for
I would
similar
definitely say so. And
political
again,
reasons. Yeah.
you know, there are individuals. There are some who favor very much favor historical Arthur, and but there's I don't know if you come across this idea as well. And I find, especially with history, is We don't have enough information, so we'll never know. I give up.
Sure.
That's like, oh well, we don't know. Like as if speculation is completely off the table. Like
That's
you can't speculate. No, you can't speculate because we don't know. We don't know.
we're clearly cut from the same cloth, probably like most of the Snake Bros listeners.
Yeah.
As soon as someone tells us like we shouldn't even consider an idea, it's like, well, I'm really interested in that idea all of a sudden, you know?
Oh, I'm going to think about now.
Well, this was fascinating. Don't hang up after I end. I'm just going to stop the recording. We can
No
say
worries.
goodbye. But I'm here today at my dad's and my stepmom's ranch in Oregon. I hear dinner sizzling in the background outside the room, and I anticipate my wife is wondering when I'm going to be done. So I'm gonna I'm gonna wrap it up. But I just want to say this was fascinating. I don't know if we talked about the stuff you expected to talk about, or no.
I have no. I mean, I think we haven't covered Brad's question, which I think is a bit sad.
Oh, tell me Brad's question. I forgot.
Brad was asking about the connection between the Welsh language and hieroglyphics.
Oh well, yeah. I obviously want to
Egyptian.
hear this. So tell me.
Well, so again, this is a lot of it's rooted in the idea of the 10 tribes stuff because
Right.
well, if Welsh is the language of 10 tribes, Israel in some way or another, then surely we should find it in Egypt when there were a lot of Israelites in Egypt. And I would definitely say there is these guys basically worked out this system. This is Barham and Blackett again of using Welsh to read hieroglyphs, and part of it is to do with it was very important of them to. It comes into this sort of Velikovsky chronology of the Middle East and ancient Mediterranean and the Greek Dark Ages and whether they actually happened or not. They were very interested in getting the Trojan War to a certain point, so then Brutus could then come to Britain. That was kind of like where they were getting at it from.
Mm.
And I don't know if that's necessary. I don't know if you need to move around the entire chronology of the Middle East just to move the Trojan War. I think the Trojan War could be slightly separate, but yeah, it doesn't really matter. But they just did.
When did the Trojan War? When did it happen? When do we think it
Well,
happened?
if you ask someone 100 years ago, they would say it never happened, and it's completely
Yeah, good
fictitious, And this is really, we're going the other way. Whereas now people are arguing about Matt Damon's armor in the new movie, saying, "Oh, it's not accurate to the time period." It's like he's fucking.
This is such a great point. You're making such an important point right now, and I wish I wouldn't have interrupted it, but I just can't hardly contain myself. Yeah, it wasn't that long ago that was a myth.
Yeah, it's complete fiction.
And now we're debating the technical points of the armor.
Yeah.
That is such a good point, and it's so applicable to Arthur.
Yeah, it really is. Well, we've seen the opposite happen basically, from where he's gone from history to myth, the other way around. Yeah, and now people can design him in any way they want and go, well, this is my Arthur character. It doesn't matter what freaking armor he's wearing. So, what I took just to very briefly bring the whole hieroglyphics thing together is that I think in ancient Britain during this Neolithic and Bronze Age periods, there is so much communication with Mediterranean, Mid East, way more than we know, way more than we give credit for, and that there are some very compelling similarities with Welsh and certain Egyptian ideas and with the hieroglyphs. And this is something that's been worked on since the 19th century, like Wallace Budge, who was a very big early Egyptologist who did loads of work. He used Welsh a lot for deciphering hieroglyphs. Whether it is the language of the hieroglyphs, again, I'm not going to say. That's way beyond my experience to be able to make that statement. But are there connections that can go across these languages? Why the hell not? I really don't see that being far-fetched at all. And I think that's what we can see, and that's what these guys picked up on, is those glimmers of connection between, the Phoenician cultures, Egypt, and whoever it was who built places like Stonehenge and Avebury.
Good Lord, that's interesting. I love this idea of whales having like this critically important role in all of these events.
Can I
So,
just cover the zodiac quickly?
yeah,
Very
please.
quickly, very quickly. So, do you remember saying earlier, once you withdraw the historical Arthur, what's this other information trying to tell us?
Right.
So, there's a set of stories called the Mabinogion.
Okay.
Now, this is a good bit of hiding. They call it the Mabinogion today, which roughly loosely translates as children's stories.
Okay.
Several of the stories inside the Mabinogion are actually called the Mabinogi. Doesn't have this on bit on the end.
Okay.
And that changes the meaning. So it then means creation stories.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So hiding in a book of kids' fairy tales are creation stories. And one day, Wilson and Blackett, they were having a chat. They were going through Middle Eastern stuff because they were looking into the really early days of in Bronze Age Britain and possibly a connection to Babylon and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And they're going through star lore and stuff, and they're talking about this one star, and they say, "Oh yeah, and this translates to the ferocious warrior." And Alan goes, "Huh? Yes, it's funny. We've got a big Bronze Age barrow on top of the local mountain called the ferocious warrior." I'm like, "All right, cool." We start going through more of these planet names, and he's like, "Well, hold on a minute. That one over there translates as that, and that one over there translates as that." And basically, what they've worked out, and if you go onto the channel I normally talk on Britain's Hidden History, you'll see we've done a series recently with a guy called Steve Willits who's followed up on their work. Basically, what they found and what Steve has confirmed, and I'm fully on board with this, like 100%. Steve has shown me thousands of data points. It's absolutely incredible. There is a ground zodiac laid out on southeast Wales in Bronze Age monuments.
Wow.
And not just any zodiac, but one that you can literally date to about 1500 BC from Babylon, because different zodiacs choose different stars and different shapes in order to make them up.
Sure.
So you, from the design of the zodiac, you can literally date it and place it, and it is undoubtedly from this like about 1500 BC. And what these Mabinogion stories are telling us is where to find these points and what happened, and literally mapping. Like a character he'll go away and then come back in a year and a day.
Yeah.
It's so classic cosmic stuff. It's literally there. The whole thing. There's references to Enki, and it's wild. It is absolutely wild. But I don't even know what to do with after that. One of the best ones is there's a little Babylonian description saying that when the bull of heaven snorts and the steam comes out and it causes a crack, and all the soldiers, this army, fell into this crack, right?
Mm.
There's only one hot springs in all of Wales, and it's exactly at the head of where Taurus would be, i.e. the bull of heaven.
Oh, wow.
And then just across this little gorge from it, there's a great big Bronze Age standing stone called the Stone of the Soldiers.
Oh, wow.
And that was written on a clay tablet that was found in Ur in the 1920s. And you can apply it to the Welsh landscape, which includes place names which are hundreds, if not thousands of years old.
Where was the tablet found?
It's one of the ones that was found in the early digs in the 20s. So like in Ur or in
oh, wow. Okay.
any of the Mesopotamian cities. That's where we get most of our knowledge about Babylonian star lore from.
Oh my gosh, that's great.
Yeah.
I would encourage, if you can find enough information, I would encourage you to make that a complete presentation.
Well, I'm hoping Steve's Steve wants to publish something on it, but I mean, he's done amazing stuff. Like, I mean, I'd love to see someone do some mathematics on it, because he's got a little video where it shows his marked named stars on a map, and then he fades a planisphere, like a modern day planisphere, in and out, and the points are like bang on.
Oh, wow, that's cool. So
and also with complementary place names where you can translate them to mean the things from the Babylonian star names. It's
that's
wild.
awesome.
And
Well,
like when I first got into this, I thought that was like one of the more far fetched things, and now I'm probably more solid on that than some of the other stuff. It's wild.
oh, that's so cool. I love that stuff. I mean, that's one of the things that's so fascinating about, places like Egypt and Göbekli Tepe is just these alignments and things. That is so fascinating. But you've now added, this has something new, which is connection between two geographical locations at a time when you would not have expected there to
No,
be a
no.
connection. That's incredible. I
Well, I
I
heard an interesting quote that said that Delphi was um, placed where it is because they set off two eagles from either side of the world, and where they met in the middle was Delphi. And then
oh,
later on in the text, they describe one of those places as being Britain. And then if you sort of draw an equal distance from Britain to Delphi and then onwards, you get to So
oh,
you've got and Britain at two ends of the world with Delphi in the middle.
that is so cool. And it kind of, obviously that's a broader geography than you would have expected at the time,
Mm.
but kind of it's realistic. I mean, that kind
Yeah,
of is the edge of the known world, right?
yeah. I mean, and like we say, like Phoenicians in the 19th century, people used to say quite happily Phoenicians travelled to Britain to trade. Now they'll say they only got really as far as Iberia. But then the other thing that archaeology has started saying over the last few years is how in depth Britain's connection to Iberia and Spain are. So if Phoenicians are in Spain and Iberia, and the Spanish and the Iberians are in Britain, then there's not really much of a jump to make there.
Yeah. Well, if there's one thing I've learned about science over the past, I'd say 5 or 10 years, is that I even put this in my book talking about quantum mechanics and stuff. It's, at any given time, everyone is 100% confident in the theory.
Yeah,
And then one day they're 100% confident in the antithesis of that theory or something
yeah,
completely different. And you're just as much of a heretic for, if you're if
yeah.
you're a year too late and you're still preaching the old theory from a year ago, you're just as
Hmm.
much of a heretic if you would have been preaching the new theory a year earlier. It's
Yeah,
it's amazing. It's just this endless cycle of confidence and certainty that is just clearly misplaced. you know?
absolutely.
So
Yeah.
I think I'm grateful for folks like you who are open-minded to pursue this kind of stuff. So that was fascinating. I hope you will come back to talk about that topic.
I'd love to. It's been very easy and very enjoyable to talk. So,
Okay, fantastic. I'm starting to get a crook in my back. If you can see me, I'm sitting on the floor.
yeah, I think I'm sat on one of the most uncomfortable chairs in my house right now. So,
Well, I appreciate that. This is a Happy Fools recording remote. So I'm not at home. So that's part of the problem here. But anyway, thank you for staying up late. It's not early there. It's got to be what, 10 by this point?
yeah, it's all
So
right.
I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
You'll probably be catapulted to fame after this and you'll be going on the Snake Bros. But if you are able to come back and talk to us, I'd love to.
Well, I was just wondering, is it just going to be me watching this, or
You'll get
me
a,
and Murray?
I mean, I don't want to, I'll get into the Happy Fools numbers a little bit. So we have a running 30-day average on our podcast platform that tells us, and there's about
Oh,
3,000 listens a month. So it's not nobody.
hey, that's awesome.
And then on YouTube, maybe we might get a few hundred. So it's not no one, but this is your first step towards your greatness, towards your Snake Bros episode.
No, no,
towards your
no.
Joe
This
Rogan
is the
episode.
greatness, Trevor. This is the peak.
I
This is
don't,
absolutely the peak.
I think of us as the farm team. We identify the talent from the Discord server, and then they go on to bigger and better things. So,
Oh, dear.
very much appreciated. That was a great topic. Thank you so much.
That's all right. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.